is the Prevalent Risk Governance Podcast, featuring conversations with today's top C-suite executives and practitioners who not only look at third-party risk governance, but push through the boundaries to protect data. Now, here's Prevalent CEO Jonathan Dambrot and third-party evangelist Brenda Ferraro.
Jonathan and I are happy to bring two very prominent individuals from Prevalent to talk about GDPR. We know that the date is coming up of May 2018, and a lot of companies are thinking about what are we going to do? John Binkley is from Prevalent. He is the Chief Information Security Officer with over 20 years of experience in the public and private sectors. And he's been helping companies to protect and enable critical operations for information security. And then we also have Brad Keller, who is the Senior Director of Third-Party Strategy at Prevalent. And he focuses on the delivery of Prevalent's third-party risk management and assessment solutions. Jonathan and I have known him from shared assessments. He's worked on the privacy committees, and he has a lot of skill and education in the security risk areas, along with a legal background. So we're happy to have both John Binkley and Brad Keller with us today.
Brenda, you know, this is a topic. Everywhere you go, GDPR.
It's funny when people don't even say it right. And you're like, oh, goodness, they're in trouble.
Well, you know, I think the tough part is everybody's talking about it. And the problem is everyone I talk to about it, there's almost zero consensus. It's one of these things that people are nervous about. Everybody's trying to figure out, you know, what my legal department needs to do, what my InfoSec department needs to do. How do we get compliant? And, you know, I'm excited that we have, you know, probably the best team in the industry here at Prevalent to have, you know, as part of this podcast and really think about it, right?
I would agree. I think this conversation is going to be so relevant to all the companies that are trying to figure out, where am I with this, or am I going to be okay? And we're taking a really good approach to thinking about it, and sharing that with the communities is critical.
Yeah. And so normally on this podcast, we generally bring people from kind of the outside world to talk about this. I think this is Prevalent's view, right? This is our team's view of what this looks like and how we're going to help educate and improve the lives of our customers, right?
Yep, I agree.
So John Binkley, there's a lot of confusion out there. You know, are we even sure what GDPR compliance means?
I think people who think that they really know what GDPR compliance is going to wind up looking like are the same kind of people who say, here, hold my beer a lot, because it's an incredibly complicated regulation that has, you know, multiple enforcement authorities. It has an incredible reach across, you know, almost every industry. So I think in the long run, it's very difficult to predict exactly where we're going to wind up and exactly how some of these things are going to wind up being interpreted. So, I mean, if anyone I think is really telling you that they know exactly how this will all play out in the next several years, you know, I think they're probably overly sure of themselves. And there's a number of really contentious issues that in some cases almost break entire business models that we'll have to deal with and find a way to live with GDPR. And that process usually involves some give and take. And at this point, we're not really sure exactly even what the enforcement mechanisms are going to look like and how heavily this is going to be enforced and who the targets of those enforcement actions are going to be. You know, while we have a good idea of what the intent of the regulation is, the translation of that intent into the actual regulatory text and then how it's actually enforced by the regulatory bodies in charge of enforcing that is a whole other matter. And the net, I think most privacy professionals think that the net that they've cast is wider than they meant to cast. And so we'll have to find some way eventually to resolve that.
So using beer analogies then, so would you say we're in the beer pong phase of GDPR? Is that kind of where, you know?
Yeah, I think, you know, if we look at, you know, the life cycle of beer tastes, and, you know, we're probably at somewhere like, you know, Milwaukee's Beast and Best and you know, Coors, not Coors Light, but what was the one I'm thinking of? Sorry, so just scratch that.
Yeah, we got to be careful.
Yeah, all beer is good.
Some of these may be customers. I'm fond of Ommegang. I don't know if they're a customer yet, but I will tell you, there are some big beer companies. But just the beer analogy, I think beer pong is probably where we're at right now. Like you don't know if you're going to hit compliance, but when you hit compliance, you can drink.
Yeah, we're at the beer pong stage, and there's probably a few people doing home brews in garage.
Yeah, but
at some point we'll have to move up to the microbreweries and the craft beers. But there's a rocky road between here and there. I mean, there's some very contentious issues that are hard to define. Things like cross-border transfer is a very difficult topic. If you just look at the text of the GDPR and some of the guidance that's come out regarding things like cross-border transfer, that's an incredibly difficult requirement to meet for anybody who uses SaaS applications or anybody who conducts business in any kind of global way. And it's very hard with supply chains these days to find anyone who doesn't conduct business with at least some global footprint. And even just some snippets of the regulation itself. There's a requirement in GDPR for state-of-the-art technologies being required. Well, state-of-the-art isn't really defined. Even just that alone is probably enough to keep lawyers happily employed and their kids in braces for a long time.
Yeah.
So, Brad, with John talking about the ambiguity of sureness for enforcement and targeting compliance with intent, the word compliance has a lot of weight and ramifications around it. What would you recommend that people look at instead of compliance? What is it that they need to look at, and what are those stages to understand the state of the vendors that they're assessing?
Yeah, that's a great question, Brenda. And I guess to kind of continue our beer theme here, it's really a change of perspective is the first stage. The disdain that Europeans have for our beer is also reflected in the disdain for what they have about our privacy practices, frankly. And it's really starting from an awareness that globally, not just with GDPR, but globally, we are expected to start doing data protection by design and default. So everything that we do should be focused not just on the security of the data. That's the easy part. The technology part is easy. It's understanding what data we have and understanding what we do with it and what we're entitled to do with it. It really starts with, it's interesting, you see all the different checklists that have come out, and it's really awareness. It's making sure that your organization really understands and is aware of this change, which is really focused on personal data, regardless of where you are, regardless of how you obtained it, but who it is and who it belongs to, and the rights that somebody has regarding that data. So there's some real changes that people have to make. And again, it's mostly process driven because it's getting into the point where you know where all your data is, where it goes, and how it's used. And what's interesting, and I think a piece that gets overlooked is a company, and we'll use the GDPR term, a data controller. So simply, whoever owns and has the right to determine how the data is being used. A piece that really isn't always fully understood is the company that controls the data has an obligation to define and dictate to their processors, to their vendors, how that data is used, or their affiliates, or their subsidiaries, or anything. If you are in the position of controlling that data and how it's used, you've got some obligations. And that's really where I see a lot of the companies balk. They're not particularly completely familiar with or willing to accept the front end obligations that they have to do before they can even start determining if they're in compliance, much less decide what it is their vendors need to be doing.
Yeah, so I think that we're looking at awareness and readiness. I think that seems to be the theme that is helping companies to better understand and become more aware of what they are doing with personal data protection in the multitude of ways and understanding what we have. Would you agree with that, Brad?
Oh, I agree completely. And, it's sort of to leverage off a point that John made. You've got folks that either think there's a whole spectrum here. There's either folks that are mildly aware that it exists, but are taking the position of, I don't care, let them come get me. I don't think they'll mess with me, to people who are overly analyzing it and trying to take action before they're ready to take action. And that really becomes the challenge when you talk to a company and they're, well, we need to make sure that we're GDPR compliant. And you ask them, well, gee, what does that mean to you? And they will tell you, well, I don't know. So in some ways, it's interesting without doing that front end work. It's almost like telling someone to paint the outside of your house, and the painter says, well, what color do you want? I don't know. I just want a fresh coat of paint. Well, it makes it really hard for the painter to help you at that point.
I will tell you that I think both Brad and I have had this experience of being in a room with highly trained and respected and privacy and security professionals and having very animated conversations about what exactly GDPR means. I've been in a room with people that I respect, and there's 5 people in the room, and we come up to what a particular point on GDPR, and there's 5 different viewpoints in that room, and everybody's coming to it with so even when you have a situation where people are trained and coming to it with the best of intentions, there's still 5 different opinions in terms of what particular points in GDPR actually require you to do.
So in that environment, I just want to say to Brad, look, some of the most American beers today were actually started in Europe. I just want to say that. I think Budweiser, by the way, was a European brand. I'm just saying, I think they would claim we ruined it. But John, going back to your point, how do you gauge readiness in that environment then? If you've got so much confusion, if you've got 5 different individuals who are, basically saying different things, it's almost going to be offensive. It's sort of like, okay, we're not going to talk about religion, politics, or GDPR. It's too offensive. Too many opinions.
In terms of gauging GDPR readiness, I'm glad you brought that up, because it gives us an opportunity to introduce Prevalent's newest product, the GDPR Ouija board, that also comes in bundled in a package with a free year-long supply of antacid, which I think is where a lot of people find themselves.
Hold your checkbook.
Yeah. Thankfully, though, that's not really the case, and I think the key is you don't have to do it alone. You don't have to gauge readiness alone. And I think the more that we can leverage bodies that reach consensus, like our partners and in shared assessments, who have come out with some GDPR guidance, that I know that we are integrating into our products. That's a way that you can leverage the experience of the entire community, the entire privacy community. So I would say first, in terms of gauging readiness, you don't have to do it alone. In fact, you probably shouldn't do it alone. But you need ways to reach consensus. And I think groups like shared assessments is one of the best vehicles, to do that. And I think the second part of this is that it starts, with you, and not to stray too far from the beer analogy. But there's a Sun Tzu quote that I use all the time, which is just, if you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result, of 100 battles. And so you have to know yourself, as well as your supply chain and what the regulations call for. And I think Brad was talking about that as well. It starts with the data, and it starts with a change in culture. So if I'm going to gauge the readiness of an organization, I want to know if, have they recognized that there's this seismic shift underway? Is there someone in the organization that's been empowered to lead the effort to comply with that? And have they been given the right resources, to do so? And, those are the kinds of things that, that some of the shared assessments content that we're incorporating can help us drive forward with as a community in general. There's some other very basic indications, really making sure, and again, this goes to a point that Brad was making earlier, really making sure you understand and that your vendors understand what the difference is between sort of traditional definition of PII and personal information. I review a lot of contracts that say, well, we don't have any, PII, which is great, but that's not what GDPR is about. GDPR uses a much more expansive definition, and it's personal information, not PII. So those are all some of the, indicators that you can look for. But you got to start with yourself. You've got to know what data you have. You have to know where it is, how it flows through your entire supply chain, your entire delivery chain, all those links in the chain. And then you have to be able to secure it and ensure the integrity of the privacy of that information, each one, of those links in that chain.
Okay, so for the indicators of privacy and recognizing seismic shift and identifying the leaders and then the right resources to control that, Brad, I'm wondering, what are some of the approaches that companies are taking? And even before companies can start holding vendors to compliance of GDPR, what are the very quick 1, 2, 3, or 5 steps that those companies should accomplish?
It's interesting because you see a complete range of responses from denial to people running around with their hair on fire and sort of all points in between. The people that are taking the most reasoned approaches are starting, we said, it's awareness, it's understanding things, but it's really first assessing yourself. And if you think about it, determining compliance with GDPR on the vendor level really isn't any different than determining vendor compliance for anything else. What you're looking at is, how do you need to do it as a company? What data do you have? How do you protect it? How does it work? What do you need to do? What kind of notifications, et cetera, all the little checklist things. And then asking that same question of your vendors. So it really starts with, conducting your own set of data mapping, understanding what data you have, where it's collected, who owns it, and what did you say to that individual. So in other words, what are your rights to how you can use that data? And once you know that, you can perform what they call a data privacy impact assessment. You're going to look at it and say, okay, I have this data, how is it used and how is it put at risk? And that's going to tell you what kind of security controls you have to have in place and what you have to manage. After that, and a piece that's interesting, this isn't something that normally comes up when we're doing normal data assessments. Normally we say, well, we've already got a vendor contract in place, so we're going to go out and make sure that the vendor's in compliance with those requirements. Well, in most cases, you're not going to have the necessary contract provisions in place. So there's an entire analysis that has to be done of your contracts with the vendor to make sure that the right model contracts are in place, that you've got the right provisions there. So there's an expansion here that has to be done of the key stakeholders that are involved in the assessment process. So you're going to have to get legal or procurement or whoever is responsible for your vendor contracts on board to make sure that all those provisions are up to place. And there are model contracts that are available to help you do that. And it's really only once you've gotten your own shop in order that you know what data you send, you know how it needs to be protected. And if you think about what I'm saying, this isn't any different than what we normally do. The change is, as John mentioned, it's an expanded set of data. What becomes personally identifiable information under GDPR is much broader than what we're used to. And there's also a second classification of data that's sensitive personal information that carries with it a whole additional set of requirements and protections. So it's really following the data and then understanding what data you send to people and how they use it. Because as I mentioned before, you have to and are required under GDPR to instruct the vendor on what they can do and how they can do it, and then measure compliance with that. So it's a much more expanded process from a number of stakeholders and a process than what we're accustomed to normally when we do assessments.
And I think the tough part here too is that there's kind of this limited timeline, right? So it's this very tight now timeline for people. So John, I'm going to go back to the beer analogy, which I think you started here. So now there's a lot of peer pressure. It's chug, 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 right? And so I'm not trying to advocate anything or drive alcoholism into the security, compliance, and risk organizations that we work with. But, really, there's not a lot of time. Got to chug. What can companies do kind of in this rapid pace to prepare themselves for what to expect and what's coming?
Well, I would say first, it's not a sprint. It feels like a sprint because there's this May 25th deadline. But it's not like you're going to wake up on May 26th and you'll never have to worry about privacy again. Or it's not like you're going to wake up on May 26th and if you didn't make that deadline, you don't have to keep driving towards that. So you need to keep taking steps, even if you're looking at that May 25th deadline, barreling at you and just saying, there's no way I can do it. Well, you have to do what you can do, and you have to continue to do what you can do until you actually reach that compliance. This is not going away, so you need to keep driving it. And I think that, if you want to triage, there's definitely things that you can prioritize. If you don't have someone in charge of this that has, a level of power and authority, necessary to bring attention to it in the organization, and to ensure that, multiple departments are giving it attention, then you need to do that. And, so in some situations, you're going to have to appoint a data privacy officer. In some situations, you won't have to formally do that, but you still need somebody to drive it, right? And that person needs to have the resources and power to move the program forward. Then, it's all about the data. What data do you have? How did you get it? What rights do you have with that data? And exactly where is it going? How is it flowing through whatever delivery cycle you're using? Even if you can just show that, hey, we know we're behind the curve here, but we've got the data privacy officer, or we've got a privacy function, we've got a data dictionary, that indicates what data we have. We have an idea of what rights we have to that, then you're on your way. And I think that, since there is some ambiguity in some of these, I suspect that intent will matter. So if you do run into an issue, you want to be able to show, that even if you're behind the ball, you're working on it. You're driving, to that goal. But it starts with that data. That's, those are the crown jewels. And you have to make sure that your organization fully understands the types of data that are involved, because it's a significant cultural shift. Especially for Americans, it's a significant cultural shift. Once you can establish that, you've actually accomplished a lot. So don't let just that May 25th deadline and the fact that you can't have everything done by then deter you from moving as quickly as you can to get everything done anyway.
Yeah, I think that's 100% right. And, I think it's sort of the same thing in security, right? This is a long-term effort to ensure that, we can ensure privacy for, individuals and companies. The one comment I will say, the thing that just popped in my head in regards to this, that goes back to our analogies and what you were saying, act responsibly. I'm sorry, I had to say that.
I had accountability in my head, so I like what you have
but
better.
don't you know, like, that's the act responsibly is the tagline for, when you're drinking, like don't.
Yeah, I was going to say GDPR.
Don't drink and drive or whatever. Now it's act responsibly. This
right.
is the tagline. Yeah.
Right. So I was thinking, like, GDPR doesn't stand for Great Draft Beer Pong and Painting Realization. It's for, general privacy.
Oh, right.
It's for something else. But what we talked about today, those analogies really resonate with me. I like how John and Brad both talked about, for GDPR stewardship, you have to keep driving towards compliance, whether you're there or not. You have to be aware and understand what GDPR is, and you have to focus on the data, the what, why, who, how, where. It's basic security hygiene and evolution of getting to that point.
To meet this GD privacy rule. That's right.
Right.
So we're going to start wrapping this up here. So I just want to thank everybody for participating. I know this is obviously a big topic internally that we've been talking about, and I know that our clients are worried. People are kind of concerned about how to deal with this, and I think this has been very helpful in kind of bringing this topic, I think, some some interesting conversation, and I think some real world ways that people can attack this and drive value for their organization. So thanks everybody for participating.
Thank you, Brad. Thank you, John.
Glad to be on.
I enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening to the Prevalent Risk Governance Podcast. Connect with us on Twitter, Facebook, and visit us at prevalent.net. You can also rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts.